I never liked camping alone, but in late September of 2019, when I was 27, something inside me pushed me to try it. I wanted to clear my head after weeks of stress at work. I picked a quiet spot deep inside a forested area in northern Colorado, a place people rarely visited once summer ended. The days were still warm, but the nights were cold and sharp. I thought the cold air and silence would help me reset. I didn't think much about danger. I just wanted to breathe without hearing cars or coworkers or anything human. I parked my old silver hatchback near a narrow dirt trail that cut deep between the trees. I walked for about 40 minutes before I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, the ground covered with layers of soft brown needles. The place looked untouched, like nobody had stepped there for months. I liked that. I felt like I had space to be alone with my own thoughts. I set up my tent beside a fallen log, built a small fire ring with rocks, and placed my food and gear in a neat circle so I wouldn't misplace anything. For the first few hours, everything felt calm. The forest had that slow, heavy feeling that comes when summer is ending. The air smelled like dry leaves, old soil, and pine sap. The only sounds were distant birds and the faint rustle of branches swaying with light wind. I cooked a packet of noodles over a small camp stove, ate slowly, cleaned everything up, and sat against the log just listening to the forest. As evening settled in, a thin mist began forming between the trees. It wasn't thick enough to block my view, but it made everything look softer and slightly warped. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease at the same time. The silence grew heavier. By the time darkness actually fell, it felt like the forest had swallowed all sound. Even insects seemed quiet. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into my tent, zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. I wasn't scared yet. I was alone, sure, but I had camped before. I kept telling myself that fear comes from imagination, nothing more. But as I lay there, staring into the dark space above me, I felt an unusual awareness settle over me. That sharp thought that you are alone and no one knows exactly where you are. That thought didn't scare me at first, but it stayed in the back of my mind like a small weight. I must have dozed off for maybe an hour when I suddenly woke up. Not gently, it felt like my body snapped awake. Everything inside the tent was still. I wasn't sure if I had heard something or if my mind had pushed me awake. I lay still, holding my breath. The forest outside was pitch black. No wind, no movement, nothing. Then I heard it. A single, heavy footstep on the forest floor. Not an animal's quick shuffle. Not the soft thump of a deer. It was slow and firm, like a person trying to move carefully but failing to be fully silent. The sound came from somewhere to the left of my tent. I felt my chest tighten. I told myself it could be an elk, or maybe a large raccoon stepping on a thick branch, but deep down the weight of the step didn't feel like an animal. It felt too controlled, too measured. I waited, frozen. Another step. This one closer. I felt my pulse thudding so hard it made my ears ring. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even breathe normally because I didn't want the sound to give away exactly where I was inside the tent. I kept telling myself that the tent walls were thin and I had nothing to protect me except a small pocket knife buried somewhere in my backpack. A moment later, the step came again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It stopped directly behind the tent. The air inside felt thin, like there wasn't enough of it. I could hear the faint crunch of pine needles shifting under something's weight. I didn't want to move the zipper or rustle the sleeping bag. I lay perfectly stiff, trying to calm my shaking. I felt exposed, like whatever was outside could hear my heartbeat. The tent fabric was so thin that I imagined a hand pressing against it at any second. I stayed awake like that for maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. Then the steps began again, this time moving slowly around to the side of my tent, circling. Whoever or whatever it was wasn't walking normally. They were taking spaced out, intentional steps like they were studying the area or trying to stay quiet. I tried to think rationally, but fear had wrapped tightly around every thought. Eventually the steps faded a little, then stopped completely. I didn't hear anything else, but the silence felt even worse. It made me paranoid, like something was standing just far enough away that I couldn't hear it. I stayed awake the whole night, too terrified to unzip the tent or make any noise. Every small sound, a A twig falling, a squirrel moving, made me tense up all over again. My muscles became stiff from lying in one position for so long. My back ached. My eyes kept darting around even though I couldn't see anything. When the first light of morning finally touched the tent walls, I felt a small rush of relief. I forced myself to unzip the tent and step outside. The cold morning air hit my face hard. Everything looked normal at first, just trees, mist, and pale sunlight. But when I looked down at the soft pine needles around my tent, my stomach dropped. There were clear footprints circling the entire camp, large, boot-shaped, and deep enough to show someone had been standing very close for long stretches of time. They weren't mine. I had walked around earlier, sure, but my prints were lighter, more scattered. These were heavier, more deliberate. They started from the trees, looped around my tent twice, then disappeared back into the woods on the opposite side. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing. Nothing was touched. But the footprints alone were enough to make my hands shake. Someone had been there. Someone had watched my tent in the middle of the night, walked circles around it, and left without saying a word or taking anything. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely thinking. I threw my sleeping bag into the car still half folded, shoved my gear into the back without bothering to organize it, and drove down the dirt road toward the main highway. Even as I left the forest, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone walking out of the trees. When I reached town, the world felt loud and safe again, but the fear didn't disappear. It stayed in my chest like a long echo. I kept thinking about those slow, heavy steps and how close they had been to my tent. I thought about how alone I had been out there. I thought about how easy it would have been for someone to unzip the tent in the dark and I wouldn't have had time to react. I never camped alone again after that. And even now, years later, whenever I hear someone stepping slowly outside my home at night, even if it's just a neighbor or a delivery driver, my body reacts the same way it did in that tent. I freeze. I listen. I wait to see if the steps will come closer. Because I learned something that night. The most frightening things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're the people who move quietly in the dark, close enough to touch your tent, close enough to watch you sleep, without ever letting you know why they were there. And what scares me most is knowing I'll never know who it was, or what they wanted. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2019, a few hours outside a small town in northern Idaho. I was 23 then, still convinced that going out into the woods by myself made me tough and disciplined. I picked a place a little off one of the old logging roads, far enough that no one would bother me, but close enough that I could get back to my car if something went wrong. I had camped alone many times before, so the idea didn't scare me at all. I liked the quiet. I liked hearing myself think. I liked the feeling that the world around me was not touching me for a while. The first few hours felt normal. I hiked around to check the area. The trees were tall and thin, the air smelled clean, and the ground was covered in dry needles that cracked softly under every step. I picked a flat space between two pines for my tent and set everything up. The sun was still high, the air warm, and the whole place felt harmless. But the uneasiness started small, almost too small to take seriously. While walking toward a nearby slope, I saw something that looked like a boot print, but the shape was odd. It was longer than a normal boot and narrower. I assumed it was just distorted by the ground. The soil there was soft from a recent rain, so prints could stretch and change shape. I didn't think about it much. I kept walking until the trees got denser, and then I turned around and went back to camp. By the time the sun started sinking behind the ridge, the forest felt different. The temperature dropped faster than I expected. The air became heavy and still. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, and as I ate, I kept hearing short, sharp cracks somewhere behind my tent. Each sound was tiny and spaced out, like something light stepping on dead branches. I told myself it was just small animals moving around, rabbits or deer, nothing dangerous. Still, every time I looked toward the sound, I felt like the trees were hiding something. When the darkness came, it came fast. One moment everything was blue. A minute later the trees were nothing but black shapes with no edges. I sat by the small fire I had made and watched the glow flicker across the trunks around me. The fire should have made me feel safe, but it didn't. The woods were too silent. No wind, no insects. Even the cracks I heard earlier had stopped. I tried to ignore the tension building in my chest and focused on the warm light in front of me. I stayed out by the fire for a while, then decided to go into my tent. I zipped it up and lay down inside my sleeping bag. It was cold enough that the air stung my nose when I breathed. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my body wouldn't relax. The quiet outside felt wrong. When a forest goes that still, something is usually watching or waiting. I forced myself to stay calm, breathing slowly, counting the seconds, trying to stop my mind from inventing dangers that weren't real. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe two, I heard it. A single, heavy step. Not like the earlier delicate cracks. This was different, heavier, closer. Something pressed the ground outside my tent, slow and deliberate. My body froze so hard it hurt. I tried not to breathe. The sound came again, this time on the other side of the tent, just inches from where my head was resting. I kept telling myself it was an elk or a big deer, but the steps didn't match. They were too slow, too careful, like someone trying not to be heard. The thing outside stopped moving. The silence that followed felt thick, almost physical. My ears strained to catch anything, even a breath or a rustle, but there was nothing. I wished I had slept with a knife in my hand or at least kept my boots inside the tent. Every second felt like an hour. The cold ground pressed into my back, and my heartbeat thumped so loud that I was sure whatever was out there could hear it too. Then came the part that still makes my skin crawl. Something brushed lightly across the thin fabric of my tent. Not a claw or a branch. It felt like a finger trailing across the material, slowly dragging from one side to the other. I stayed absolutely still. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. An animal wouldn't trace the outline of a tent like that. It wouldn't move that slowly and deliberately. The touch stopped. I lay there waiting, unable to think clearly. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, without warning, the steps started again. Moving away this time, very slowly, as if whatever it was kept looking back at me through the dark. I didn't sleep at all after that. I waited until the faintest bit of pale light appeared outside the tent. As soon as I knew the sun was rising, I unzipped the tent and got out. The air was freezing, and the ground was wet with morning moisture. I looked around carefully. My campsite looked normal, but right beside my tent, the soil showed prints. Human prints. Bare feet. Long, narrow, and deep from weight. They circled my tent once, then continued into the trees. My fire pit was undisturbed. My food bag was untouched. Nothing was stolen or moved, but the prints were clear. Someone had walked right up to my tent in the middle of the night with no shoes on. Someone who took their time. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook the whole time. I didn't stop to eat or check the area again. I just kept feeling like whoever it was might still be watching from between the trees. When I finally reached my car, my fingers could barely hold the keys. The drive back to town felt unreal, like I wasn't fully awake. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the main road, the fear didn't vanish. It settled into me in a quiet, steady way, the kind of fear that changes the way you look at the world. I still go hiking sometimes, but I haven't camped alone since that night. I don't think I ever will again. There is something unsettling about knowing that the scariest things in the woods are not animals or storms or strange sounds. They're people you never see. People who move silently in the dark. People who walk barefoot around a stranger's tent and leave without ever saying a word. That night taught me something simple and clear. The forest is safest when you believe you're alone, but the danger begins the moment you realize you aren't. And I learned that too late, lying in a dark tent while someone traced their fingers across the thin fabric, as if trying to memorize the shape of the person inside. I drove out to the northern edge of Redwood Valley in the summer of 2019, thinking a weekend alone in the woods would clear my mind. I was 27 then, tired from months of long shifts, and I wanted a place where nobody expected anything from me. The land out there was quiet, with tall pines leaning over narrow dirt roads and long stretches of empty space where sound barely traveled. I chose a spot about 5 kilometers off a small service road, near an old logging area that had been abandoned for years. There were no official campsites there, just open forest, dry needles on the ground, and a few patches of flat earth where people had camped before. I set up my tent near a fallen tree, laid out my sleeping bag, and cooked a small meal on my portable stove. The first day felt calm. The air smelled like sap and dust, and the quiet felt heavy but peaceful. I spent the evening walking through the woods, listening to the crunch of pine needles under my boots. The sun went down slowly, leaving the forest covered in a soft orange glow before darkness swallowed everything. That night, the forest felt different. The air cooled faster than I expected, and the silence grew deeper, like the trees were holding their breath. I felt a bit uneasy, but I told myself it was just the first night alone. I tried to sleep, but the ground felt harder than usual. I kept turning, trying to get comfortable, but every time I started drifting off, I would hear something faint in the distance. It wasn't anything strange, just small noises. Twigs snapping, branches shifting, the usual sounds of wildlife. Still, I felt wired and alert. At around midnight, I heard something heavier, not a small animal. The sound was slow and uneven, like someone stepping on dry branches with too much weight to be a deer. I lay still inside my tent, staring at the fabric inches from my face, waiting for the sound to fade. After a few minutes, it did. I tried to steady my breathing, and eventually I managed to sleep a bit. The next morning, the light looked soft and gray when I stepped outside. The air felt colder, and the ground looked disturbed. A few meters from my tent, the dry needles were pushed aside, showing patches of dirt and small shoe-shaped imprints. They looked fresh. At first I guessed they were mine, but the pattern didn't match my boots. The steps were smaller and placed closer together, like someone had paced around the area during the night. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I pushed it aside. I convinced myself it must have been leftover footprints from someone who camped there earlier in the week. I ate breakfast, drank some water, and started a short hike deeper into the forest. The sun helped calm me down. The woods looked bright again, full of green light filtering through the branches. When I came back in the afternoon, something new was near my tent. A tin can crushed almost flat. I hadn't brought any cans. I looked around, scanning the trees, feeling that same uncomfortable pressure in my chest. The forest looked still, but it suddenly felt narrower, like the trees were crowding closer. I stayed outside my tent until sunset, just watching the woods and trying to spot anything out of place. That second night came faster, with heavy clouds covering the sky. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the footprints and the crushed can. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a sound again. This time it was closer. It wasn't walking. It was a slow drag, like something being pulled through the dirt. My skin felt cold. I stayed completely still, listening as the dragging sound moved behind my tent and then stopped. I didn't know how long I waited. It felt like hours. I only moved when the first weak light of dawn appeared. I stepped outside and saw a long mark in the dirt, about 2 meters from where I slept. It looked like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. My stomach tightened. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. I decided I would leave that day, but I stayed long enough to pack my things properly. I didn't want to rush and forget something important. While I was packing, I noticed something else. On the fallen tree beside my tent, there were fresh scratches. Long, thin marks carved into the bark. They were at shoulder height, as if someone had dragged a knife or a metal tool across it. The scratches were too clean to be from an animal. For the first time since I arrived, I felt true fear, not from the noises, but from the idea that someone had been close to me on purpose. I packed faster and started walking back toward my car with my backpack weighing heavily on my shoulders. The woods felt different now, colder and unfamiliar. Every sound made me tense up. I kept imagining someone watching from between the trees. When I finally reached my car, I felt a rush of relief so strong my hands shook. Before starting the engine, I looked back at the trail. Far down the path, half hidden by the trees, I saw something that still sits in my mind even now. A figure stood there, not close, not moving, just standing. I couldn't make out details from that distance, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. The shape was too straight, too human. I didn't stay long enough to study it. I locked my doors, started the car, and drove away so fast that dust kicked up behind my tires. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there for several minutes. My hands still shook, and my heart felt like it was trying to break out of my chest. I didn't look back again. I drove all the way home without stopping. I never reported anything. Nothing actually happened to me, nothing physical anyway. But I know what I saw. I know someone was in those woods with me. Someone who walked near my tent in the dark. Someone who dragged something across the ground. Someone who carved marks into a fallen tree. Someone who stood and watched as I left. Since that trip, I've never camped alone again. I still like the outdoors, but I stay in busy campgrounds now, surrounded by people. Every time I think about Redwood Valley, I feel that same cold pressure in my chest. I know it wasn't a ghost or some creature out of a story. It was a person, a real person, and the real world is always scarier than anything made up. I decided to camp alone in late October of 2019, far from the city noise I had been stuck in for months. I picked a spot in northern Idaho, close to a lake I had seen once on a road trip. I was 27 that year, tired from work, tired from people, and I wanted silence. The cold air felt clean, and the forest around the lake looked empty enough that I thought I would have the whole place to myself. I brought a small tent, a sleeping bag, a gas stove, and enough food for 2 nights. I planned to hike during the day and rest by the water in the evening. The first day went exactly how I wanted. I walked through long stretches of pine trees, dry leaves sticking to my boots, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. The lake was still, almost frozen, with a thin layer of ice forming near the edges. I set up my tent near a cluster of fallen logs where the ground felt flat. The air dropped fast when the sun went down, and I wrapped myself in my jacket. Watching the sky turn dark felt good to be alone. I fell asleep without trouble, but sometime in the night I woke up to a sharp, short noise outside my tent. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, but I assumed it was just branches cracking under the cold. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning felt colder. The ground was stiff with frost, and the lake had a thicker sheet of ice across the top. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to hike deeper into the woods behind my tent. I didn't bring much with me, just a water bottle, a map, and a small knife. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet for a place that big. I expected to hear birds or at least wind through the trees, but everything felt still. I kept walking for hours, following a narrow path that looked like an old trail, though I didn't see any signs or markings. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange. The trail suddenly ended at a clearing that looked recently disturbed. The grass was bent down in wide shapes, and the dirt had deep marks, like something heavy had been dragged across it. I stood there, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like anything an animal would do. The spacing of the marks seemed too straight, too mechanical. I felt a slow wave of unease crawl through me, but I kept looking around the clearing, trying to figure out what happened there. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing else. I turned around and headed back toward the lake. The sun was already starting to lower, and I didn't want to be too far from my tent in the dark. The air felt colder than the night before, and the silence felt heavier. By the time I reached my campsite, the sky was turning orange. My tent looked untouched, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the air around the camp had shifted in a way that made my skin feel tight. I cooked a small meal and tried to warm myself near the stove. The light from the flame made the inside of my tent glow faintly, and for a moment I felt safe again. I went inside my sleeping bag early, hoping sleep would come fast, but my mind kept going back to the marks in the clearing. I couldn't stop imagining what could have caused them. Sometime after midnight I woke up again, this time with a clear sound outside. Something was moving near the tent. The sound was slow and steady, like deliberate steps, but not human steps. The weight felt uneven, too heavy at some moments and too light at others. My heart started beating so fast I thought it might wake whatever was outside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. I just waited, listening to every shift of movement. The steps circled the tent once. Then the sound stopped at the back of it, right near where my feet were. I could hear something pressing lightly against the fabric, like it was testing the material. I couldn't understand what kind of animal would move that slowly and that quietly, especially in the freezing cold. The pressure on the tent grew stronger, and I could feel the fabric stretch slightly toward me. I stayed frozen in place. The sound lasted for maybe 10 seconds, but it felt much longer. Then, without warning, the pressure disappeared. The steps moved away, slow at first and then faster, until the forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep at all after that. I waited inside the sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, counting down the hours until sunrise. When it finally got light, I crawled out of the tent, my body stiff from cold and fear. I checked the ground around the campsite, expecting tracks or some sign of what had come so close. But all I saw were faint indentations, long and narrow, spaced too far apart to be human but too straight to be from an animal. They led from the trees right to the back of my tent and then back into the woods. I felt sick looking at them. I didn't pack slowly. I grabbed everything and stuffed it into my bag, not caring about order. I didn't eat, didn't clean up, didn't look back at the lake. I just started walking. I stayed on the main path, the one that led back to the parking area miles away. I kept checking behind me, even though I didn't hear anything. The cold air made my face hurt, and every step felt too loud. When I finally reached my car, my hands shook so much I struggled to get the keys into the door. Once inside, I locked the doors immediately, even though it didn't make much sense out there in the open. I drove away fast, barely breathing until I saw the highway. I never went back to that lake. I even avoided the whole area for years. I still think about the marks in the clearing, the strange steps around my tent, and that slow pressure on the fabric. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or anything impossible. It was something real, something alive, something that didn't care that I was there. The ending is simple. I got out in time. I survived. But I left that place with the clear understanding that not every fear comes from things we imagine. Some fears come from real things that move through the dark, things that live far from people, things we don't have names for because we don't see them often enough to understand them. And I know that whatever walked around my tent that night is still out there, somewhere in those woods, following the same paths, leaving the same marks, waiting for the next person who thinks they want silence and solitude. I had been waiting all year for the break. In early September of 2021, I finally took a week off from work and drove out to a remote part of northern Montana, somewhere I had never camped before. I was 28 at the time and wanted to see how well I could handle being out there alone. I liked camping, but I had never gone this far into quiet, empty wilderness where I could walk for miles without seeing anyone. Part of me wanted the challenge, and part of me wanted to get away from people and noise for a while. I parked as far as the dirt road allowed, loaded my pack, and started hiking into a valley that looked untouched. There were tall pines on both sides, patches of open meadow, and a long shallow creek twisting through the middle. I followed the creek for nearly an hour before I settled on a flat spot where I could see the water but still have enough tree cover for wind protection. It felt peaceful, and in the first couple of hours, I actually enjoyed the silence. By evening, the sky turned a pale orange behind the ridge. I set up my tent, gathered some dry sticks, and lit a small fire to cook dinner. The air smelled like pine sap and cold water. Nothing felt wrong, not even a little. If anything, I felt relaxed in a way I hadn't in months. When it got dark, I sat by the fire and watched the flames move. I remember thinking the whole trip might end up being boring in a good way. I went to sleep around 10. The night was cold but quiet enough that I drifted off without much effort. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of branches snapping in the distance. First, I ignored it. Animals move around at night all the time. But the sounds didn't fade away. They grew slower and heavier, as if whatever was out there wasn't wandering but moving with some direction. I stayed still. I kept my eyes closed, telling myself it was probably a deer. After maybe a minute, everything stopped. No footsteps, no snapping, nothing. The silence felt strange. Even the creak sounded muted. I stayed awake for at least an hour, staring at the roof of my tent, listening so hard that my ears rang. But nothing else happened. Eventually, I fell asleep again. In the morning, the first thing I noticed was a set of footprints near the tree line. Not animal prints, but long, narrow human footprints, pressed into the dirt and moss. They led from deeper in the woods toward my campsite, passed behind my tent, and continued toward the creek. They looked fresh. The ground had been soft from last week's rain, and these prints were crisp around the edges. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. I knew I hadn't walked in that area. I had barely wandered more than 20 feet from the tent the night before. I tried to convince myself some hiker had passed through at night. Maybe someone was lost. Maybe someone knew this place better than I did. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. I packed my food tighter, cleaned around camp, and forced myself to treat it like nothing. But the prints stayed on my mind all day. I spent the afternoon following the creek and taking photos of the ridge. I told myself I would stay the second night because leaving early would make me feel weak. I had come here to be alone, and technically nothing had happened yet. I kept repeating that. Nothing had happened. That night, the air felt heavier, warmer even though the sun had dropped. The stillness felt unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath. I crawled into my tent early and tried to sleep. Maybe an hour later, I heard the same snapping of branches. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was slow, steady, deliberate, almost measured. I lay on my back, staring into the darkness. My heartbeat felt too loud. The footsteps came closer until they seemed only a few yards away. I could hear breathing, low and uneven, like someone trying not to make sound but failing. Then there was a long pause. I lay frozen, barely letting myself take air in. My tent rustled. Something brushed against it. Not a quick sweep, but a slow drag, like fingertips moving across the fabric. The pressure was light, but enough that the wall dipped inward. The breathing outside grew heavier for a moment, then stopped completely. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't even swallow. After several seconds that felt like minutes, the sound drifted away. The steps retreated into the woods, one at a time, until they were no longer there. But I didn't sleep, not for a second. When the sun finally rose, the first thing I did was unzip the tent and look around. More footprints circled the campsite. They were the same long, thin shape as the ones from the day before, but now there were more of them. Some came right up to the tent's edge. I saw the drag mark where the hand, or whatever it was, had touched the fabric. My entire body went cold. There was no sign of gear, no trail marker, no pack prints, nothing that suggested a normal hiker. Just those footprints coming from the dark woods. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't clean up. I dumped water on the fire, stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could, and left the campsite behind. I didn't run, but I walked harder than I ever had in my life, checking behind me every few seconds. The woods felt different now, too quiet, too watching. Even the creek sounded far away, like it wasn't part of the forest anymore. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside without caring how it landed. I drove back down the dirt road, hands shaking on the wheel, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds even though I knew no one would be following in daylight. I never went back to that valley. I never even looked up the exact area again on a map. And I learned something I didn't expect. The scariest thing in the woods is not a ghost or a creature. It's another human being you can't see, who moves around your camp at night, who watches you sleep, who never says a word, and who leaves no trace except footprints you weren't expecting to find. I stopped camping alone after that. Every time I think about trying again, all I can picture is the shape pressed into the tent wall and the slow, patient breathing on the other side of the thin fabric. I understood then that out there, away from roads and help and people, someone can get close to you without ever needing to say a single thing. And that is enough to change the way you see the woods forever. I had been wanting a break from everything for months, so when I finally got a full weekend off, I decided to spend it camping alone in northern Alberta. It was late September of 2023, and the air had that early cold that hits before snow season. I was 27 back then, and for some reason I thought I understood the woods well enough to handle a trip with no one else around. I picked a spot near an old logging area about 40 minutes from a small town. The place wasn't marked on most maps anymore. It looked empty, quiet, forgotten, and that was exactly why I wanted to go. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already sliding down behind the tall pines, and everything had that orange glow that makes the world look older than it is. The road was rough, just gravel and dirt, and by the time I parked my old gray SUV, I was tired but excited. I dragged my backpack and tent into a small clearing that looked like it had been used years ago by hunters or workers. There were no signs of recent activity. The grass was long, the ground uneven, and the only fresh marks were from my own boots. I set up the tent slowly, wanting to enjoy the silence. I could hear the distant sound of a river far through the trees, and somewhere deeper in the forest something moved now and then. Nothing unusual, just the kind of natural noise you expect when you're surrounded by miles of woods. The air smelled like pine sap and cold soil. Everything felt peaceful. When I finished, I collected some fallen branches for a fire. They were mostly damp, so it took a while to get everything burning. As the flames grew, the warmth made my face sting a little from the chill around me. I made a simple meal, ate, and sat with my back against a log while the light faded. I wasn't thinking about danger or anything strange. I was just glad to be away from work and people. Around 9 p.m., the temperature dropped fast. I decided to crawl into my tent and lie down even though I wasn't tired yet. I left the fire burning low outside. As I settled into my sleeping bag, the forest sounded different. The wind was slower, quieter, heavier somehow, but I didn't think much of it. I checked my phone, no signal as expected, and turned it off to save battery. Then I closed my eyes. I must have drifted off because I woke up to the feeling of something cold on my cheek. At first, I thought it was condensation or maybe the fabric of the tent brushing against me as I shifted. But when I opened my eyes, I noticed the tent fabric on the left side was pushed inward, slowly bending, like something was pressing from outside. It was subtle, barely moving, but steady. For a second, I convinced myself it was only the wind. The problem was, I couldn't hear any wind at all. I didn't move. My whole body felt tight. I stared at the fabric, expecting it to fall back into place, but it didn't. It kept bending, as if someone, or something heavy, was leaning against it. I tried to stay calm by telling myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe even a large dog from a nearby farm. But the pressure on the tent wasn't random. It held in one spot, firm like a hand pushing. After maybe 30 seconds, the pressure slowly went away, and the fabric returned to normal. I waited another full minute before unzipping the sleeping bag. My hands were shaking so much it took longer than it should have. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to make noise. I just held it in my hand like it would help. For hours, nothing happened. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. The fire had died completely, and the air inside was cold. The forest felt empty in a way I'd never felt before, like every creature had gone silent at the exact same time. Around 3 a.m., a new sound started. It wasn't footsteps or growling or anything dramatic. It was softer, more controlled. It sounded like something lightly scraping across the ground, moving slowly past the right side of the tent. Not dragging feet, dragging something else. Something solid against dirt. The sound didn't speed up or slow down. It moved with purpose, like someone pulling a bag or a tool across the ground. The scraping passed by, paused near the back of the tent, then faded into the trees. I didn't breathe for almost a minute after it was gone. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt my ribs. I held the flashlight tighter even though I still didn't turn it on. When the sky finally started to turn pale blue, I forced myself out of the tent. My legs were stiff from staying frozen all night. The morning air was freezing, and the grass was wet with dew. I checked around the campsite slowly, expecting to see nothing, hoping to see nothing, but the ground told a different story. There were marks in the dirt, not footprints, tracks. Long shallow grooves running from behind my tent toward the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a sled or a dragged branch, but the grooves were too even, too straight, like whatever made them was pulled carefully. There were also kneeling marks beside them, clear impressions of knees pressing into dirt. Human-sized, not animal. The fire pit had been disturbed too, as if someone had sifted through the ashes with their hands. My backpack, which I had left zipped and leaning against a stump, was opened. Nothing was stolen, but everything inside was moved around, rearranged, touched. That was enough for me. I packed everything fast, barely thinking. My hands were shaking so hard it felt like they belonged to someone else. I threw my gear into the SUV without caring about the order. When I finally slammed the door and locked it, I just sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the trees. The forest was calm again, quiet and harmless, but nothing about it felt peaceful anymore. It felt watched. I drove out of that place without looking in the mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached the small town, where I finally pulled over near a gas station and sat there for half an hour, trying to understand what had happened. There was nothing to report, nothing illegal, nothing clear enough to prove. No one had attacked me. No one had destroyed anything. But someone had been out there with me. Someone had walked around my tent, touched my things, and watched me sleep for who knows how long. I never returned to that area again. I still camp sometimes, but only in marked parks with other people around, and I never sleep deeply on the first night. I think the worst part isn't the fear I felt that night. The worst part is knowing there are places quiet enough, empty enough, and forgotten enough where a person can walk right up to your tent, study every inch of it, and leave without ever being seen, leaving only enough evidence to make sure you know they were real. And the scariest truth is that whatever was out there wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a person, someone who wanted to get close without being caught. Someone who had a reason to move that quietly in the dark. Someone I will never identify, but who clearly had no fear standing inches from my face while I slept. That is what stays with me. Not the noise, not the marks, not the cold air pressing in on the tent. What stays with me is the realization that in the middle of the woods, far from everything, the most dangerous thing you can meet is another human being who doesn't want you to know they're there. I went camping alone in the fall of 2019, a few hours outside of Helena, Montana, in a place called Miller Ridge. I had spent most of my 20s hiking and doing small weekend trips, but I had never camped this deep in the woods by myself. I picked that area because it was quiet, not popular, and the ranger I spoke to earlier that week said most people avoided it since the trails were confusing and not well kept. At that time, that sounded perfect to me. I wanted to be alone, away from my phone, away from work, away from city noise. I wanted to feel small in a big place. I reached the ridge late in the afternoon. The sky was pale and the air had that cold smell that only comes when summer is truly gone. I parked my old truck at the end of the dirt path and carried my pack down toward a narrow opening in the trees. The ground felt soft from old pine needles, and the deeper I walked, the more the air changed. It was quiet, but not peaceful, just a little too still, like everything was watching me. I told myself it was only because I had left the noise of the truck behind. By the time I found a small clearing, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The clearing wasn't perfect, but it gave me enough space to set up my tent and store my food in a bear canister a good distance away. The air kept getting colder, so I gathered dry branches, small sticks, and fallen bark to build a fire. Once it caught, the heat felt good on my hands. The world outside the orange glow dropped into darkness quickly, and the shapes of the trees turned into tall shadows leaning in every direction. For the first hour, everything felt normal. I cooked a simple meal, checked my pack, and sat near the fire, listening to the crackling logs. But around the time the flames started dying down, I heard something out in the trees. It was small at first, like leaves being pushed aside in a slow, dragging way. I thought it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't move like an animal. It stopped and started again in uneven patterns, like something stepping, then pausing, then stepping again. I tried to ignore it. I added more wood, trying to get the fire to burn brighter again. But the strange steps kept repeating. They circled my clearing, staying deep enough in the dark that I couldn't see anything. Every few minutes the sound changed spots, as if whatever was out there kept moving around me. It made the back of my neck feel tight. I convinced myself it had to be just wildlife, so I forced myself to stay calm. But I still kept glancing toward the dark tree line, trying to catch any movement. Nothing appeared. Eventually the sound stopped completely, and the silence came back. That silence was worse than the noise because it felt intentional, like something waiting. I decided not to go inside the tent yet. Instead, I stayed near the fire, feeding it slower, trying to keep it alive without burning through all my wood. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the fire had burned down to almost nothing. Only a few glowing pieces of wood were left. The cold hit me first, then the stillness. My breathing sounded too loud in the empty forest. As I stood to gather more wood, a new sound broke the quiet. It was faint but sharp, something metallic hitting something hard. I froze. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't natural. It sounded like metal scraping stone, slow and rough, like someone dragging something across the ground. The noise repeated, each scrape longer than the last, coming from the northwest side of the clearing. I stood still for so long my legs felt numb. My flashlight was inside the tent, but I was too afraid to walk away from what little light I had left. The scraping finally stopped, replaced again by the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I didn't sleep after that. When the sky slowly brightened to gray, I packed up as fast as I could. My hands kept shaking, not just from the cold but from the feeling that I had been watched all night. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just stuffed everything into my pack and started hiking back toward the dirt road. But the trail looked different in the daylight. I couldn't tell if it was just my anxiety or if I had actually taken a wrong turn the night before when setting up camp. Trees looked too similar, and the ground was covered with the same rust-colored pine needles in every direction. I followed what I believed was the right way, but the path twisted strangely, and soon I couldn't even hear the river I had passed the day before. At one point, I stepped into an area where the trees were thinner, and I noticed something on the ground ahead of me. It looked like a piece of metal, long, dark, and half buried in the dirt. When I got closer, I saw it was an old camping knife with a cracked handle. The blade was dull and stained. The metal looked weathered, but not rusted enough to be more than a few years old. The strange part was how it lay there, placed neatly across a flat stone, as if someone had set it down rather than dropped it. I didn't want to touch it, but seeing it made something inside me tighten. I didn't want to wait around to figure out who it belonged to. A cold wind hit the back of my jacket, and I suddenly felt like someone was behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there, but the feeling didn't go away. I kept moving, faster now, pushing through the trees even when branches scraped my arms. My pack felt heavier. My heartbeat was loud enough that I could feel it in my throat. Every few minutes I thought I heard something behind me, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. Each time I looked, I saw nothing but the tall, silent trees. After almost 2 hours of walking, I finally reached a spot I recognized. A small fallen pine with a charred trunk. From there, I knew the road was only another 15 minutes downhill. Relief came all at once, so strong it almost made my knees weak. I didn't stop moving until I saw the silver roof of my truck through the trees. When I reached it, everything was exactly the same as I had left it. I threw my pack into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. Even inside the truck, I felt like the forest was pressing in around me. I didn't take one last look. I just started the engine and drove until the trees were far behind. I never went back to Miller Ridge after that. I never even looked at a map of it again. For a long time, I didn't tell anyone what happened because I didn't know how to explain it. There was no clear threat, no proof that someone was out there, nothing I could point to and say this is why I was afraid. But the fear I felt was real. It was the kind of fear that comes from instincts, the old kind buried deep in the body that only wakes up when something isn't right. The scraping sound, the strange steps circling my camp, the knife placed on the stone. Maybe each thing alone could be explained, but together they formed something I couldn't ignore. I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is that I wasn't alone, and whoever was watching me stayed far enough in the dark that I could never see them. That uncertainty has stayed with me ever since, and it's the reason I stopped camping alone. Not because of wildlife or weather or getting lost, but because out there, in a place that quiet, you can feel when someone is watching you, long before you ever see them. And sometimes you never see them at all. I had always liked being alone outdoors, but that summer in 2019 I pushed it too far. I was 26 then, and I had taken a few days off work to clear my head. Instead of joining friends on a group trip, I picked a remote camping spot in northern Idaho, far from the busy lakes and the RV parks. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat if you stand still long enough. I didn't want to follow the usual marked sites either. I looked at an old map and found a place by a narrow creek, a few miles off a forest road that wasn't even paved. I packed light, just a tent, my old backpack, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, a gas stove, a water filter, and a hunting knife I mostly kept for cutting rope. I knew the area had bears and mountain lions, but I had read enough survival manuals to think I could handle myself. Back then, I thought caution was a kind of weakness. I parked my car where the dirt road faded into grass and walked for nearly 2 hours through uneven ground. The air was hot, dry, and filled with the smell of pine needles warming under the sun. Every step kicked up fine dust that settled on my boots. When I finally reached the creek, the sound of water moving over rocks felt like a kind of reward. I set my tent on a patch of flat soil under tall fir trees. I thought the trees would make it easier to stay cool and protected from the wind. I remember feeling proud of the spot. It looked perfect, something out of a photo meant to advertise peace. The first day went well. I gathered firewood, boiled water, ate a simple meal, and watched the sunlight slowly fade. When darkness came, it came quickly, swallowing everything outside the reach of the small fire I had built. I didn't feel afraid that night. I was used to the sounds of animals moving through brush at night. I had camped before, but even then, there was something different about this place. The forest felt too still at times, like something was watching from far away, waiting for me to make a mistake. I pushed the thought away. Spending too much time alone can play tricks on you. Halfway through the night, I woke to the feeling of vibration in the ground, faint but steady. At first I thought it was part of a dream, but as I opened my eyes, I felt it again, a slow, rhythmic thud. It wasn't footsteps. I had grown up around farms and knew what footsteps sounded like when they carried through packed dirt. This felt heavier, more spread out. I lay still, listening to the forest. No cracking branches, no breathing, no growls, nothing. The thuds came a few more times, each a few seconds apart, then faded into silence. When I finally forced myself to check outside with my flashlight, nothing showed except trees and shadows. I tried to convince myself that the noise had come from a distant logging machine or maybe loose rocks shifting on a slope. The next morning, I walked along the creek, climbing over stones still cool from the night. A few small fish darted away as I moved. I felt better in daylight. I kept thinking how the brain fills empty darkness with its own fears, making small things seem large. I hiked for hours, exploring the forest, picking markers so I wouldn't lose my path. When I returned to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. A piece of dry wood that I had stacked neatly near the fire pit was scattered across the ground. Not tossed far, just shifted, as if someone or something had stepped through it. I tried to blame the wind. Even though the air had been calm all day, I accepted the explanation because it was easier. By the second night, discomfort had settled into my chest. I fell asleep late, listening for anything out of place. Sometime deep into the night, something snapped me awake, the sound of fabric tightening. I knew instantly that it was my tent, being pushed or pulled slightly. I froze. My breathing became silent without me meaning to. I could feel someone or something moving outside, brushing against the nylon. No footsteps, just the movement. Slow, deliberate pressure slid across one side of the tent, starting near my feet and traveling upward. The thin material bowed inward, but not enough for me to see a shape. The only thing between me and whatever was outside was the flimsy zipper. I stayed absolutely still, refusing to breathe deeply, trying to slow my heartbeat because it felt loud enough to be noticed. After a long moment, the pressure eased, and the outside went still again. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. I waited nearly an hour, staring at the roof of the tent, replaying the moment in my head, trying to decide whether it had been a large animal or a person. I didn't hear any walking afterward, which almost made it worse. When dawn finally showed itself through the trees, I crawled out to inspect the campsite. The dirt around the tent looked scuffed, but the ground was too dry and uneven to show clear prints. Some of my firewood was moved again, not broken or taken, just shifted slightly out of the pile. My stomach tightened. I forced myself to eat something even though my appetite was gone. Logic and fear battled in my head. I didn't want to leave because leaving meant admitting something had been wrong, that I had been watched or approached while I slept. But by late morning, I knew I had to pack up. The fear wasn't something I could shake off. Something had come too close to me, closer than anything should have in a place where I was completely alone. I packed fast, stuffing everything into my backpack without my usual care. As I lifted the tent, I felt a cold tightness at the base of my neck, like the air behind me had shifted. I didn't turn around, couldn't. I just shouldered my pack and started walking toward the direction of the car. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. Every sound made my body tense. Branches snapped in places I couldn't see. Birds flew up in sudden flocks as if something larger moved through the trees behind me. I kept walking, never speeding up into a run, because running felt like it would trigger whatever might be out there. My legs shook near the end, but when I finally saw the glint of my car through the brush, my chest loosened in a way I can't fully describe. When I reached the road, I tossed my pack into the back seat and locked the doors before even sitting down. My hands shook on the steering wheel. As I drove away, dust rising behind me, I kept checking the mirror even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. To this day, I still don't know what visited my campsite. Maybe it was a large animal acting strangely. Maybe it was a person who had been living out in the forest and didn't want to be found. Maybe it was someone wandering off a trail and deciding not to announce themselves. I will never know. What I do know is that something was there, something I could feel in the shift of the tent fabric and the silent movements outside. Something that stayed just long enough to let me know I wasn't as alone as I believed. The ending is simple and clear. I left, and I never went back. That trip taught me that nature is not empty space waiting for me to explore it. It holds things, animals, people, and moments that don't explain themselves. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never in places that feel too quiet. Some silence is peaceful, some silence waits, and once you hear that difference, you never forget it. I went camping alone in the summer of 2019, a few miles outside a small town in northern Montana. I was 24 at the time and thought I knew enough about the outdoors to handle a simple 2-night trip. I had camped before, but always with friends. This was the first time I decided to go completely alone. I told myself it would help me clear my head after months of stress. I imagined peaceful nights, quiet mornings, and long hikes without any noise except wind and birds. I packed too much gear, thinking that more things meant more safety, but I didn't really understand that safety in the wild had more to do with awareness than supplies. The area I chose was an open forest mixed with tall pines and uneven ground covered with dry needles. A narrow dirt road ran through it, rough enough that most people didn't drive far in. I walked about a mile from where I left my car and found a small clearing with flat ground. Tall trees circled the area like walls. There was no sign of recent campers. No footprints, no ashes, nothing moved. It felt untouched, which I liked at first. I set up my small gray tent beside a fallen log and stored my food in a metal container a little away from the tent, just like the guides online said. The first day went smoothly. I walked around the area, tested my small stove, prepared a simple meal, and watched the sun drop behind the tree line. By the time the sky turned dark blue, the temperature began to fall. I sat outside my tent for a while, listening to the sounds of bugs and small animals moving through the dry leaves. The forest felt alive, but not in a threatening way. It felt like the normal activity of the woods. I felt calm enough to assume the night would be easy. When darkness finally settled, the silence became heavier. The forest didn't go quiet, but the sounds changed. Instead of small rustling here and there, I began to notice long gaps of silence followed by sudden cracks in the distance, like something heavier than a rabbit or squirrel stepping on dry branches. I tried to ignore it and crawled into my tent. Inside, the air felt colder. I zipped my sleeping bag and turned on a small battery lantern that gave off a soft yellow glow. As the hours passed, I struggled to sleep. I kept hearing movement outside. At first, it stayed far away, almost too faint to worry about. But around midnight, I heard something much closer. Something stepped on a thick branch, breaking it in a sharp snap that made my pulse rise. The sound came from somewhere behind the tent, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I held my breath, hoping it was nothing more than a deer, but the weight of the steps didn't match a deer. It sounded slower and heavier, like something that took careful steps instead of fast, nervous ones. I lay still in my sleeping bag for a long time. My heart kept beating hard in my chest. I didn't move or make any noise. I kept trying to convince myself that animals walked near tents all the time and that nothing strange was happening. But then I heard something else, breathing. Not loud, not close enough to feel, but clear enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. Slow breathing, steady and controlled, coming from the direction of the trees behind the tent. A cold wave moved across my skin. I told myself it was the wind, but the air was too still for that. I wanted to look out, but unzipping the tent would make noise, and I didn't want whatever was out there to know that I was awake. I stayed like that for maybe an hour, barely moving. The breathing faded eventually, and the night returned to its scattered forest sounds. When dawn finally reached the tent, I felt like I had hardly slept at all. I stepped outside to warm sunlight and expected to see nothing unusual. But I noticed tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, but the faint shape of shoe prints. The pattern on the ground was uneven and smudged, but it was clear enough to see that someone had walked around the area during the night. The prints circled behind the tent, stopped near the log, and then continued back toward the trees. I felt a knot grow in my stomach. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest hiking trail was far away, and the whole forest area was basically empty at this time of year. I tried to calm myself by thinking it could have been an old hunter or someone exploring the woods, but the prints were fresh. The edges of the impressions weren't softened by wind or animals. Someone had been there just hours before. I decided to stay for the second night anyway because I didn't want to feel like I had been scared away by nothing. I spent the day trying to enjoy the trip, but the feeling of being watched kept creeping in. Every time I looked into the trees, the shadows looked deeper than before. By sunset, I felt uneasy, but I tried to act normal. I ate early and cleaned up everything. I made sure to secure my food again and pack anything that might make noise. I went into the tent just after the sky went dark, hoping I could fall asleep early, but sleep didn't come. The forest seemed even more silent than the night before. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, around the same time as the night before, I heard movement again. Slow steps coming from the same direction. The air around the tent felt tight, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The steps stopped right behind the tent. I felt frozen. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was standing there. Not an animal, too quiet, too controlled. I could hear the soft sound of breathing again. This time it felt closer, steady, and human-like. The tent walls were thin. Anyone standing inches away from them would know if I moved. My heart pounded so hard I worried the sound would give me away. I kept still, barely breathing. After a long moment, I heard the soft crunch of steps moving away. Slow, careful, almost patient steps. They faded deep into the woods until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep at all that night. The moment the first light hit the trees, I packed everything as fast as I could and left the campsite without even eating breakfast. When I reached my car, the sun was already rising, and I finally let myself breathe normally again. When I got home later that day, I thought about everything that had happened. I knew the forest had animals, shifting temperatures, and strange sounds, but none of those things explained the shoe prints, the slow breathing, or the way someone stood only a few feet from me 2 nights in a row. I realized that nothing supernatural had happened. The scariest part was that it had been a real person. Someone moving around in the woods with no explanation, no reason, and no attempt to announce themselves. That thought stayed with me longer than the fear itself. I had gone camping to clear my head, but instead I learned something I never forgot. The most frightening things out there are never creatures or spirits. They are people. Quiet, patient, and hidden where no one can hear you ask for help. I never planned on camping alone that summer, but things don't always go the way you expect. It was 2019, and I had just turned 23. I wanted a quiet break from everything, so I packed my gear and drove out to a remote forest area near Pine Ridge, a place people didn't visit much. Most campers preferred the lakes farther north, but I wanted silence, long trails, and a place where the only sounds came from the wind and the insects. I thought that would help clear my head. I didn't know that silence sometimes hides the things you shouldn't ignore. I parked my car on a dirt patch beside a narrow path and walked almost 2 miles into the woods. The trail wasn't marked, but I had downloaded the map on my phone and brought a compass just in case. The air felt warm and still, with the scent of pine needles and dry soil drifting around me. My backpack felt heavier than usual, maybe because I was carrying more than I needed, or maybe because I already felt a strange nervousness that I kept trying to ignore. I found a small opening between tall trees where the ground was mostly flat. Sunlight came through the branches and drew bright patches on the ground. I set up my tent, unpacked my small stove, and gathered some dry wood for a fire later. Everything seemed normal enough. I walked around to explore the area, trying to get used to the place. The forest smelled clean, like sap and warm bark. I kept hearing tiny things moving in the leaves, maybe small animals or birds hopping around. Nothing weird yet. By the time evening came, the air had cooled. I cooked a simple meal and sat near the fire as the sky slowly turned dark. The woods grew quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. No voices, no engines, just the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own breathing. The deeper the night got, the more I felt like something was watching me. Not in a supernatural way, but like someone could be hiding behind a tree, just out of sight. I tried to ignore the feeling because the mind plays tricks when you're alone. Around midnight, I climbed into my tent and zipped it up. The darkness outside felt too thick, like it soaked through the fabric of the tent. I lay on my sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling of the tent for a long time. My mind kept drifting into random thoughts until I finally started to fall asleep. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. I didn't move at first. My eyes stayed open, staring into the pitch black inside the tent. I didn't know what woke me, but I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like my body sensed something wrong before my mind did. I held my breath without thinking. Then I heard it, a slow, heavy sound in the leaves outside. Not the quick rustle of a rabbit or a fox. This sounded deliberate, like a person putting weight on each step. Leaves pushed aside, twigs snapping softly, one step after another, getting closer to my tent. My heartbeat jumped. I didn't sit up. I didn't make a sound. I stayed completely still, listening. The steps stopped right beside the tent. Whoever or whatever was out there was standing only a few feet away from me. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, slow and deep. My mind raced. I didn't believe in ghosts or any of that, but I did believe in people. And people could be dangerous, especially far from help. I stayed frozen for maybe a full minute, though it felt much longer. Then the steps started again, moving around the tent slowly, like someone was circling it, checking it, studying it. I felt sweat move down my back even though the air was cold. I gripped the small pocket knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. It wasn't much, but holding it made me feel a little less helpless. The steps moved farther away after circling my tent twice. Then they faded into the darkness. I waited for a long time before I even tried to breathe normally. I didn't sleep at all after that. I kept listening to every small sound until the sky finally turned gray. As soon as the morning light arrived, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground was covered with footprints. Not boot prints, just worn-down shoe prints like someone had been walking barefoot inside thin, old sneakers. The prints looked messy, like whoever made them had been dragging their feet. Some prints were only a few inches from my tent. I packed my gear faster than I ever had before. I didn't bother making breakfast or folding the tent neatly. I just stuffed everything into my backpack and started walking back toward the trail. The forest, which had looked peaceful the day before, now looked different. The trees felt closer together. The silence felt heavier. About halfway back to my car, I found something I hadn't seen on the way in. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a branch. It looked like a part of a jacket sleeve, faded and dirty. I didn't touch it. I just kept moving, faster and faster. When I finally reached my car, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were more footprints near the rear bumper, the same worn-down pattern I had seen by my tent. Someone had been near my car, maybe even waiting around it while I slept deep in the woods. I unlocked the door, got inside, and drove off without looking in the mirror. I didn't feel safe until I reached the main road and saw other cars again. Only then did I feel like I could breathe normally. Later that week, I searched online for anything strange reported near Pine Ridge. I didn't find much, just a few mentions of people hearing noises at night or seeing someone moving through the woods alone. But no details. Nothing clear. Nothing that explained the footprints outside my tent or the breathing in the darkness. I still think about that night more than I want to. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. Whatever walked around my tent wasn't an animal. I know how animals sound. This had weight, slow steps, and human breathing. Someone had been out there, watching me in the dark, walking around my camp while I was trapped inside a thin piece of fabric. The ending is simple, but it's the truth. I never went camping alone again. Not because I fear the woods, but because I realized the scariest thing out there isn't nature. It's the people who hide in places where no one else goes. And the worst part is that I'll never know who walked around my tent that night, or why they left without doing anything. Maybe they changed their mind. Maybe the sunrise scared them away. All I know is that they were there, and that is enough. I never liked camping alone, but in the summer of 2022, when I was 27, I drove out to a remote place in northern Alberta just to clear my mind. It had been a heavy year, and I wanted the quiet more than anything. I picked a spot near a long, narrow lake that sat between two slow-rising hills. The gravel road that led there was old and full of pits, the kind of road you only take when you want distance from everything. I remember passing the last small town nearly an hour before I reached the lake. After that point, it was just forest, open sky, dusty road, and the feeling that you're going far beyond where most people ever stop. By the time I arrived, the sun was halfway down. The air was warm but still. The water was almost flat, showing a faint shimmer from the sunlight slipping behind the trees. I parked my old silver SUV on a patch of dirt close to the water and stepped out. The silence hit me first. Real silence. Only the soft buzz of insects and the distant tapping of branches. I unloaded my gear slowly, trying to enjoy the calm. My tent was a simple two-pole dome, nothing fancy, but I knew how to set it up in minutes. I placed it near a small slope where the ground was the most level. I laid my sleeping bag, my thick pad, my small LED lamp, and a metal water bottle inside. Outside, I set up a metal folding chair next to my small fire pit. I collected branches, bark, and whatever dry wood I could find. Everything felt normal and peaceful. When the fire finally caught and the flames rose, I felt a small comfort. I heated a can of soup over the fire, watched steam curl up into the cold air, and took my time eating. The smell of smoke mixed with pine. The edges of the lake slowly turned darker as the sun disappeared. I stayed near the fire long after I finished eating because it was the only warm and bright thing around me. When the sky turned fully black, I felt the weight of isolation. Not fear yet, just the strong awareness that no one else was around for many miles. My phone had lost service hours earlier, and there was no sign of any other camp. No headlights, no voices, no passing boats. Just my small fire, the dark woods, the black mirror of the lake, and me. I decided to walk a little around the shore before sleeping. I carried a small flashlight but kept it pointed at the ground. The dirt was soft near the water. I saw prints from deer, a few from what looked like a coyote. Nothing unusual. I followed the shoreline a little farther, trying to stretch my legs. That's when I saw something strange. There was a narrow trail along the waterline that looked recently disturbed. The dirt was pushed aside in a messy way, not like tracks from an animal but more like something dragged. It created a thin path from the trees straight toward the lake. I crouched down and touched the dirt. It was loose, freshly moved. I looked around, but the trees behind me were pitch black. I tried to follow the trail with my eyes, but it vanished into the darkness of the woods. A cold feeling spread across my back. I forced myself to walk back toward my campsite, telling myself it was probably a fallen branch or a washed-off section from the last rain. I didn't sleep right away. I sat next to the fire again, poking the glowing wood, trying not to pay attention to every snapping sound in the forest. The night grew colder, and I could feel the temperature drop each minute. When the fire finally died down, I got inside my tent and zipped it closed. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first, it was normal. Leaves shifting, insects buzzing, the distant ripple of water from the lake. Eventually, my breathing slowed. I felt myself drift toward sleep. Then I heard it. A slow, heavy step on the dirt outside my tent. Not an animal. The weight was too solid, too steady. The step was followed by another, this time closer. My whole body froze. I kept my eyes open even though it was dark inside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe normally. I heard the steps circle around the tent. Not fast, not loud, just steady and deliberate, crunching softly on the dry ground. I felt someone, pause right behind my head. The silence after that was worse than the steps. It stretched on until seconds felt like minutes. I could hear my heartbeat clearly inside my ears. I waited for another step, but nothing came. When I finally built the courage to move, I reached for my flashlight very slowly and pressed the button. The inside of the tent lit up, but I didn't open the zipper. I didn't dare. I stayed like that for hours, gripping the light, staring at the zipper door, waiting for the tent wall to move. I remember counting my breaths just to keep myself from panicking. Eventually, the sky outside turned lighter. I realized morning was coming. Only then did I unzip the tent and step out. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. They were deep, human, and all around the tent. The size looked larger than mine, maybe a man's boot, but worn down enough that the shape looked uneven. They circled my tent once, then headed toward the water, stopping only a few feet from the shore. The lake surface was still. The woods were quiet. Nothing looked disturbed except those prints. I packed up quickly, not bothering to clean anything properly. I kept checking the tree line, expecting someone to step out. My hands were shaking as I took down the tent and tossed everything into the SUV. I looked one last time at the footprints near the water. The trail I saw the night before suddenly made more sense. Someone else had been there. Not recently, last night. I drove away fast, not caring about the rough road. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Only then did I let myself breathe normally again. Later, when I told myself the story again, I realized the thing that bothered me the most wasn't the steps around my tent. It wasn't the size of the footprints or the fact that the person stood behind my head for so long. It was that the tracks leading toward my campsite came from the woods. But there were no tracks leading back. Whoever was out there never walked back into the trees. They either went into the lake, or they were still somewhere in that area when I drove away. And that thought has stayed with me every single time I've tried to camp again. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. I didn't tell anybody where I was going that weekend. It wasn't because I wanted to disappear or anything dramatic like that. I just needed a quiet place where I could breathe for a bit. Work had been eating my head, and every sound in the city felt sharper than it needed to be. So on a cold morning in late October of 2019, I packed my old backpack, a cheap tent, a metal water bottle, and enough food to last me 2 days, then drove toward the Pine Valley Reserve in northern Wyoming. The reserve wasn't a famous place. It wasn't even marked clearly on most maps. It was just a long stretch of rough land filled with tall trees, dry grass, and dirt trails that looked like they were made by animals rather than humans. I liked that. I liked the feeling of being away from everything, even if it meant dealing with rough paths and the kind of silence that made my ears ring. I parked my car at a makeshift pull-off area and started hiking. The only sound was the crunch of cold dirt under my boots and the soft hiss of wind moving through branches. The air smelled like pine needles, dry soil, and the faint bitterness of early winter. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't painful either. The kind of cold that kept me awake. After about an hour, I reached a narrow clearing. It wasn't perfect, but it was flat enough for my tent, and the nearby trees acted like a windbreak. I set everything up, tightened the ropes, checked the ground for rocks, and laid my sleeping bag out. I felt proud of myself in a small way. I wasn't an expert camper, but I knew the basics. The day passed quietly. I walked around, collected small fallen branches for the fire, and ate a sandwich that tasted better than it had any right to taste. The sun dropped early, turning the sky into a dull gray. I lit a fire, sat beside it, warmed my hands, and watched the flames twist around the wood. The fire made the clearing feel smaller, like everything outside my little circle of light could be miles away or just a few steps behind me. When it got too cold to sit outside, I put out the fire properly, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. The sleeping bag felt stiff and cold at first, but it warmed fast. I listened to the wind for a long time, trying to relax. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up some time after midnight with a pressure in my chest that felt like a warning before my brain understood anything else. The tent was dark and heavy with cold air. At first, I didn't hear anything except my own breathing. Then something broke that quiet. It was the soft crunch of footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Not the rapid, light tapping of deer or the scratching steps of raccoons. These steps were slow, careful, human. I froze. My hands tightened inside the sleeping bag. The footsteps moved along the outside of my tent in a half circle, like someone was inspecting the shape of it. I could hear the faint brushing of fabric as they passed close against one of the tent walls. I didn't breathe. I waited for the steps to stop, and they did, right near the front of the tent. Seconds passed, maybe a minute. I had no idea. Then I heard the click of metal, the sound of something small and sharp brushing against something hard. It was a sound I recognized from camping videos online. The accidental tap of a knife against a buckle or belt. My skin went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. I stayed still, forcing myself not to move even a finger. The steps slowly retreated, not running, just walking like whoever it was didn't care if I knew they were there. Eventually, the sound faded into the dark woods, leaving only the wind and the pounding of my heart. I didn't sleep at all after that. Every tiny sound felt like it could be footsteps returning. The tent felt too thin, like a single layer of cloth was the only thing separating me from something I didn't want to see. When the first hint of morning finally came, a pale blue light barely touching the tops of the trees, I slowly unzipped the tent door and peeked outside. The clearing looked normal at first. Empty, quiet, harmless. But then I saw the footprints. There was a clear line of boot prints circling my tent, close enough that whoever made them could have touched the fabric without bending down. The prints were deeper on the front side, like the person had stood there for a while, watching. I packed everything in minutes. I didn't care about neatness. I stuffed the tent into my backpack, threw on my jacket, and started walking back toward the car as fast as my legs could handle. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The woods felt alive in the wrong way, like someone was matching my pace from somewhere I couldn't see. When I reached the parking area, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made my knees weak. But that relief was short-lived. My car wasn't how I left it. There were fresh boot prints around the driver's side door, not mine. And on the dusty rear window, someone had dragged a finger across the surface, leaving a short line. Not a word, not a message, just a single dragged line, like someone wanted me to know they'd been there without giving me anything else. I got inside, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. Only when the reserve was miles behind me did I start to breathe normally again. I never reported it. I didn't even tell friends. I didn't want the questions, the disbelief, the suggestions that it was just a hunter or some harmless hiker. I knew what I heard. I knew how close those steps were. And I knew that whoever walked around my tent that night wasn't lost, curious, or confused. They knew exactly what they were doing. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't plan to ever again.